This show was previously broadcast live on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com.
Welcome to Expanding Mind, an investigation ongoing into the culture of consciousness. And when you have something as squirrely as consciousness as your object of exploration, you need maps. And one way of looking at the various wisdom traditions of East and West and North and South is as a bunch of maps that help us organize our sense of our own minds, the relationship to emotions, to our body, to nature, to the cosmos. So astrology or the tarot or the meridian lines of acupuncture or the chakra system of Hindu Tantra, all of these are sort of active maps. And what I mean by active map is that they're not just static representations of the way things are. They are actually maps that become alive and organic as you engage with them. They begin to open up. So it's almost like if you spend more time in that Hindu Tantra universe boning up on the chakra system and the nadis and the pingala and all that stuff, that more and more your experience will grow to shape and fulfill that map. So it's a co-creative situation of our own attention and our own awareness and our own creative imagination engaging with these maps that have roots in very deep patterns of the human being and of nature itself. So it's a more co-creative process than I think we bring to a lot of maps. But then you have this question of so there's all these maps. Well, what do I look at? Do I start to mix and match? Do I stick with one for 25 years? Do I try to recreate one based on my own experience? Do I accept the traditional language and traditional assumptions that go along with a lot of the mystical maps that come down to us from the ages? Or do I attempt to revitalize those in a language that's more contemporary, that's more in tune with neuroscience and biology and information architecture and all our more modern languages for understanding flow and experience and consciousness? One of my favorite maps is one that I first encountered in a Robert Anton Wilson book, and then later read about in some of Timothy Leary's writings, and that is the 8 circuit model. And one of the things I'm very happy about today's show is just the fact that there is another book about the 8 circuit model. And the author of this book, Antero Alli, is one of my favorite writers and figures in this sort of world of fringe consciousness, self-transformation, a man who's aware of the maps and the meta-maps and how to weave ourselves between them. And I have found this model particularly to be very influential because it bridges a lot of traditional understandings, particularly of the energy system and the different basic layers of consciousness, with a sort of more contemporary awareness of different levels of social reality, anthropological reality. And all of these authors have had their own twists and takes on the model, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I'm curious, I'd like to bring on our co-host, Expanding Minds esoteric librarian, Maja Daou. Maja, have you spent much time with the 8th Circuit model?
I have, Erik. I got introduced to it a long time ago when I was in high school, when I first read some of Timothy Leary's stuff. And I am really excited to talk to Antero today, too, because it's like you said, there's all these old maps that we've had for a long time, like, astrology and the I Ching and stuff like that. But one of the really exciting things I think that's happening now is we're getting it put into modern interpretation, like you said. And I think that's something that Antero does really well with the 8 circuit map, because Timothy Leary kind of lays it out, and his brain is so technical and crazy and kind of almost a little bit cold. And then Antero weaves in that anthropological way of looking at it through experience and really kind of, I almost want to say, adding a little heart into it. So I think it brings that 8-circuit model up to another level through Antero's eyes, because he's able to kind of like put a little soul into it through his experiences of it. So my experience with the 8-circuit model before his book was, it's like you can interpret it and work with it and use it, but then, having someone to share their wisdom and digestion of it is what I really appreciate with this work that he did.
Great. Well, we're going to bring Antero on here. I just wanted to mention just a little bit more about him. He sort of made his name way back. I'm not sure whether it was in the late 70s, I think, or the early 80s, with his first book, Angel Tech. And in some ways, his new book, The 8-Circuit Brain, is a sort of return to some of that material with 20-plus years of more of experience in addition to it. So he's written a number of books. He is also an astrologer, and he's principally, at this point, a filmmaker. And he does some remarkable, independent, very thoughtful, very engaging, sometimes very disturbing independent films that he does in an extremely unique fashion, often with his wife, Timothy Alli, supporting it through music and composition and acting. And so he's a very fascinating fellow, and I'm happy to have him on Expanding Mind. Antero, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Is Ali a normal Finnish name?
It is when it's pronounced in the Finnish way, which is to pronounce both L's, so it's Ali. Otherwise, it will sound as if it's just one L, and that would be more Arabic.
Right. So you've made peace with people pronouncing it Ali.
I've made peace with people in a big way.
Very good, very good. Well, I did want to just let you kind of guide this a little bit from the get-go, because we could start talking about the 8-Circuit Brain as a new book and a new revitalization of this model. But I know that this model is also something you've been working with for a long time. So it might also be interesting to find out when you just first discovered it and how you reacted to it at that point, and how your feelings for it have changed over the time.
I first discovered it, I think, the same way the both of you did, is through Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger book. And I think, if I can remember, my first reaction was just a kind of astonishment that that Leary had passed the torch, meaning taken it from the Hindu chakra system and brought it to a level that I just found really astonishing. I just didn't have words for it. I was just kind of blown away by it. And the more I read, Leary's books, like your co-host said, I found it theoretically quite brilliant, but missing in the application of how would I experience these circuits. I can understand the map he's creating, and it's really quite a brilliant and eloquent map. And then I asked Robert Anton Wilson, who I got to know a little bit in the early 80s, on a personal basis. I asked him about that, and Bob just told me, he said, people would understand Tim a lot better if they understood his nickname back in the Harvard days. And I go, well, what was his nickname? And Bob says, Theory Leary, because he produced reams and reams of theory. So I came to know Tim's work as the work of a theoretician, and then Bob's translation of Tim's circuit model and his Prometheus Rising book brought it to a whole different level, because Bob's forte is really kind of a multiple systems theory, where he takes the system and connects it to all different kinds of neurosciences and political science and social sciences, and so he's very good at mapping multiple systems and drawing connections between multiple systems. And that looked very exciting too. And then Bob did something very clever in Prometheus Rising, is that he started inserting these kind of exercises and word games, or just little hints of directions for the reader to begin applying this and that to come into some direct experience of what the circuits might represent. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, and I think I might be able to even put it forth further into the flesh. And so I've been working for the last 25 years on what I call an embodiment bias. And this relates a lot to what your co-host said. There's a word that really stuck out, digestion. You know, how is it that a person can assimilate and digest and integrate all that they've absorbed? Because we're really in a position of running the risk of a kind of information OD, of being able to absorb all this information. But I'm thinking if you haven't found a way to integrate it or digest it or put it through your own system and have it come out in your own language and your own vision as a result of digesting it, I think it's just going to produce a kind of mental constipation or a kind of congestion in the psyche where you can't really take in any more information until you have digested what you've already got. And part of the result of, that kind of constipation is a kind of regurgitation of information, where there's constantly recycling the same information because it has not been digested.
I almost feel sometimes that it's what people, the more and more we process information, it's not simply that we just regurgitate, but that a lot of what we are encouraged to do is simply like pass it on to others. It's like you see the way people use the internet where there's just some little tiny bit of something. You get it in your email box and you just think of the 10 people who would like it and you spread it on to them. Yeah. And I think it's partly that the move away from digestion is because there are a lot of forces that are pushing us towards these weird kind of collective information networks where the real action is not in the individual person. It's in the way this information moves around, and there's something kind of exciting and interesting about that, and it's part of what's happening in our world. But to my mind, if you don't also or even principally put your attention on the digestion in your actual experience, in your actual body, in your actual life, then you're almost kind of just giving yourself over to this process doesn't really care as much about what's going on in your brain, except for the way that it hosts information temporarily as it spreads around.
Well, it'll just lead to a kind of superficial thinking about it.
That was one thing I liked about Robert Anton Wilson's interpretation of it, is how he deeply took in the meaning of the Eighth Circuit thing and then saw how it applied everywhere. And you could see that it was because he really absorbed the information and took it in, and then he saw it everywhere. And so that's different. Some people will just take these little snippets and then they take it from everywhere, but there's no connections made. And in your book, Antero, and in Robert Anton Wilson's, one of the things I really like is that because you guys have really taken the information in, then you can say, oh, look at this, you can see it here and here, and you can kind of then see how these brain models are connected to things outside of ourselves in our lives and in the world and stuff like that.
So, Antero, just to let people get a little bit more of a handle on what we're talking about, can you just explain a little bit about what the Eighth Circuit brain map is like, or maybe perhaps by comparing it with the Hindu Tantra system that I guess it's sort of derived from?
Well, basically, the Eight Circuits represent 8 functions of intelligence. So if you can imagine intelligence with a capital I, like the universe expresses intelligence. And the Eight Circuits suggest that in the human being, in the human system, there might be these 8 functions of intelligence: physical, emotional, intellectual, social, somatic, and what I call the Sixth Circuit, psychic or intuitive intelligence, the Seventh Circuit, genetic intelligence, and the Eighth Circuit, quantum non-local intelligence. And if you can also imagine that all of these 8 functions exist within each individual at various degrees of expression and latency, and they're all in interaction, meaning they all express, in a sense, almost like, different brains interacting or talking with each other. But very rarely are we in any kind of conscious cognition of that kind of interaction. So part of the work with the Eighth Circuit brain is starting to kind of fine-tune our listening processes, our receptivity, our attention to the various frequencies and levels of intelligence within us. And I think part of the purpose of the model is to, besides basic self-knowledge, is for the more adventurous of us to begin mapping where our genuine sources of ignorance are, where we are not really absorbing, integrating, or transmitting our experiences very well, and also to begin tracking where intelligence really is active in us so that we can basically come to confess the knowledge and the intelligence we do have, so we can become comfortable with where we are intelligent and, really assist, the world or other people with the intelligence that we are carrying. But I think that is almost impossible, at least in my experience, if you're not also willing to become aware of where, your real ignorance is, where you're lacking, some experience in not just absorbing experience and information, but also, like we talked about earlier, digesting it and transmitting it, how to articulate what you know. I think is a big part of what helps us understand that someone is intelligent. It's not just enough that you know something. Is how are we going to know what you know unless you find a way to articulate or express it, whether it's through words, images, music, physical gesture. So there's all different ways of defining language in the process of articulating intelligence. It's not just through words and text.
Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about the model, picking up from what you said initially, is it seems to me one of the tricky challenges of being, a human, having a human consciousness, is that we have this really remarkable ability to believe or experience ourselves as being more or less coherent and singular no matter what's going on. So I'm the same me, wakes up in the morning and I feel groggy, and then I get angry at the tax man, and then I'm kissing my wife, and I see a puppy, and I'm happy. But through it all, it feels like there's this singular me that is being sustained, and all these things are just kind of happening. So it's harder sometimes to recognize how diverse, multi-layered, and sometimes and often contradictory we are in terms of what structures our consciousness. I mean, we know that through moods, and any given day we'll go through a whole range of moods, and if you're identifying with each mood, it's sort of a carnival of different perspectives. So obviously we're changing that way, but there's a subtler, more not hierarchical, but more layered way of understanding ourselves that involves these different kinds of intelligences, including very base ones that we often don't even really want to acknowledge are going on, levels of fear, levels of possessiveness, of desire for security. And one of the things that I think makes the model very powerful and very honest is that the first four levels are very readily understandable in terms of anyone looking at their own experience with a good, strong lens would start to recognize these more attached, almost like evolutionary levels that are coming out of it. So then once you sort of establish that, then the higher, more weird circuits begin to make a little bit more sense in a kind of evolutionary model rather than just a metaphysical map.
Yeah. In my second book, the one that just came out called The Eighth Circuit Brain, the subtitle, by the way, I think is telling, Navigational Strategies for the Energetic Body. In the new book, I focus on how the lower circuits are intimately connected with the upper circuits, specifically how circuits 1 and 5 are connected, 2 and 6, 3 and 7, and 4 and 8, and how really the lower circuits can act as anchors to help us absorb the shocks of new experience, sometimes called weird experience, of the upper circuits, and also how the weirdness or the new or novel experiences of the upper circuits can act as catalysts and growth for the evolution of the lower circuits. However, for that model to work, for it to really become an operational model in your life, I think it's very important to begin destroying any kind of upper circuit or lower circuit bias, where, people think, oh, it's the upper circuits that are superior to the lower circuit, or, that sort of thing, where you get into this kind of archetypal chauvinism where you think any one circuit is better than any other. And I'm thinking that they're all equal in value, because you really can't do without the foundation if you're going to, build up into the upper levels, without the foundation, a strong, supple, and flexible foundation. The upper circuits, when activated, it can be quite dangerous.
Yeah, what you're saying here is actually really quite significant, in that even for modernizers and very creative modernizers like Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, that nonetheless there's a kind of inherited transcendental bias in most mystical systems that we might look at from around the world, and that is only kind of encouraged by some of our own modern Western biases towards rationality, a distrust of the body, distrust of the feminine, fear of the earth, fear of death. So there's a way in which even alternative, supposedly progressive mysticism has inherited some very profound turns away from the body. And while there's countervailing tendencies in paganism, for example, that even within a lot of mysticism and even psychedelics, there's this tendency to kind of, as you say, like emphasize or prioritize the higher circuits, the transcendental, cosmic levels of experience. And I think it ends up creating a lot of difficulty for a lot of people in terms of integration. And even within the New Age or mysticism, or people who are interested in consciousness issues, there's lip service is often paid to the body and to the world. But I don't actually feel that the hard work of integrating quote-unquote lower or more base or more primitive or more incarnate, not that those are all equivalent, but they're linked in a very deep way with some of these lower circuits, to actually really integrating them with the higher ones, and the ethical and personal challenges in doing that seem to be one of the key points of places of current evolution, is that difficult work. And so I'm curious how you see what you're doing, and even in contrast with Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, in terms of that transcendentalist bias.
Yeah, both of them tend to demonstrate in their books a certain upper circuit favoring, or upper circuit bias. And so my bias is what I call the embodiment bias. And the embodiment bias requires quite a bit of courage towards full-on self-acceptance. And what that means is just that. Working with full-on self-acceptance also means having the courage to face some of the consequences and effects of what Wilhelm Reich referred to as the emotional plague epidemic in the society that has somehow fixated in the cultural mindset a false division between mind and body. And what this has as a consequence is a kind of a socially corrosive effect. It's not this individually corrosive, it's socially corrosive, this emotional plague, which again is perpetuated by any kind of belief that ascertains any kind of split between body and mind, or let's say upper circuit and lower circuit. So I think the first step is really exposing where the emotional plague may, have us, and where we might be suffering from that, and exposing those beliefs, those outdated beliefs. Many of them are carryovers from what I would call the shadow side of Christianity. I mean, in every religion, Christianity included, they have some really wonderful and, quite wise principles to, guide your life. But then there's also these shadow sides, and one of the shadow sides of the Christian ethic is really, ties into the, demonization of the body and sexuality and, earth religions, and the pagans as devils and, on and on. So really the first level of work, I think, must address the lower circuits and dealing with the exposure of self-denial and seeing if you can turn that around to into the courage of more and more self-acceptance as a basis, as a foundation for the self-support system you're going to need to do higher circuit work in a scrupulous way, meaning a way in which you're not courting a psychotic break.
Well, and this is one of the reasons why I thought your work in this book was so important, because you hearken back to those true philosophies of Tantra, which I felt like Leary, I know you said that he based it on, Dr. Adams' work, you mentioned, had introduced him to Hinduism and the chakra work and stuff like that. But it seemed to me like Leary did make that separation and that kind of more focus on the higher circuits. But in Tantra, it's through the body that you get to the realizations of the higher circuits. And it's through those literally the lower chakras, that you get to the higher chakras. So that was another reason why I really liked this book, because it went back to that tantric idea of accessing it through the body, through the below, and placing that connection back in there, which, I really think most people just still keep it very separate.
Yeah, it's I would say, again, a cultural epidemic. It's not entirely our fault. We have to really look at, that notion of a kind of on a collective level of how it is that you might be able to extract your identification from these kind of culturally imposed beliefs and ideas that we just absorbed, without knowing better. Mm. And forgive ourselves for doing that, because it's created some damage that does require healing before any work can, really occur.
Antero, can I ask you, I know this is a personal question, but you talk a lot about the shocks that are catalysts into exploration of some of these upper circuits. And I was wondering if you had like a big whammy that hit you, like was there a particular big shock that you saw happen as you were studying these models that helped you to really have an experience to understand the 8 circuit model?
There's been a series of what I would call outside shocks, meaning shocks that I personally did not instigate or plan. And these are actually outlined in my new book, The 8th Circuit Brain, in the final section called How I Got This Way. It's a neurological autobiography, a chronology of outside shocks and hedonic upgrades throughout my life from birth to present. I think the way I would like to kind of frame this word shock, because it gets a lot of bad press. Shock isn't always a bad thing. But in context to the 8th Circuit Brain, specifically the upper circuits, 5, 6, 7, and 8, I think each of them correlate with a specific type of shock. And the 5th Circuit, I think, correlates with the shock of ecstasy. And I see real ecstasy as a shock to the system. Mm. And it's a shock to the system because each person has their own threshold of how much ecstasy that, they can absorb and integrate before they start wigging out or dispersing. Ecstasy is a powerful event. And the shock of the 6th circuit is the shock of uncertainty, which is to say uncertainty as an objective truth, that nobody really knows what's going to happen next. And to whatever degree you can permit uncertainty, the mind starts opening up, the attention starts opening up to new levels of seeing. As you learn to permit more uncertainty, you can learn to live basically with more awareness. The 7th circuit, I think, relates to the shock of indivisibility. And what that means is that it's those moments that whatever it is that happens to you results in an experience where you don't feel any separation from anything else. And you really do experience yourself as an expression of the universe, of the world, and, whatever you do to someone else, you're doing to yourself. So there's that indivisibility is its own shock. And the 8th circuit, I think, represents the shock of impermanence. And oftentimes that'll come around through some significant losses, either of material possessions or losses, especially sudden losses loved ones, the end of a relationship, or, someone that you're in love with, passes away suddenly, and all of a sudden the experience of impermanence escalates. Well, the objective truth of impermanence is always there. It's always there. And as we gain more access to that and learn to live with the fact of impermanence, the Eighth Circuit experience avails itself to us a little bit more. However, all these shocks can be quite accelerating in our experience of the life force, and so we really have to find a way to anchor, so we can not float off the planet, so to speak, not disembody and, enter, an unintentional death wish or a suicide romp. And that's where the lower circuits come in, is that each one of them have very specific ways, once integrated, to help anchor some of these upper circuit experiences of shock in our lives.
One word I wanted to ask you about that Leary also used, and you use as well, is hedonic. Mm-hmm. And I bring it up because I think that there's some very deep and very helpful resources in the idea and even the pursuit of hedonism, taken in the right way. Usually we use that word and people think it means pursuing superficial pleasures or addictions, being sort of stuck in, mere pleasure circuits. But it seems that one of the things that animates this model, it's one of my favorite things about Leary, and I think it's in here too, is that anytime you're really dealing with the energy body, is that you can approach it as if the goal or the game is to increase and refine pleasure, but not pleasure in, the superficial sense. That's why it's nice to have a different word, hedonic, something, a circuit that hums, a circuit that moves towards a sense of depth and connection and even bliss. Because it seems to me that we all have that. We all have a draw towards pleasure. It's very basic. But if we really are paying attention, we realize how all of the patterns we have about pleasure are coupled with pain and limitation. And so if you're going I just want to do this pleasure thing better, you're forced to actually engage all of the ways that we hide in fear and limitation and suffer pain and separation and physical challenges, because you're like, no, there's something more beyond that. And there's a way in which there's almost like the spiral of what you could call spiritual hedonism, where by keeping your eyes open, any given plateau of pleasure or expansion or wonderfulness will raise new issues and new challenges. It's like instability is not very fun a lot of the time, and yet by integrating it, by opening up to it, then suddenly these new dimensions appear, and it's like, oh my God, there's something beautiful in there. There's something blissful in there. So there's a way in which there's a kind of intelligent bliss, goal-seeking, that can motivate a soul through what is in many ways an extremely difficult process. And so it's something that's always kind of intrigued me, because it's so different than a lot of traditional systems where even if they're talking about bliss, they mean it in almost a different way, where there's something specific about the way that the personal pleasure seeking, the basic hedonic impulse, can be directed and sent off in this much deeper, much more challenging and much more revelatory way.
Well, the hedonic impulse moves the individual away from herd mentality and towards the pleasures of their own body, but also towards the higher stratas of brain pleasure, and on and on. And so there's a natural moral reaction from the herd or the group. There's a moral judgment placed on hedonism and pleasure because it's a threat to the moral structure, to the group structure. It's a natural threat. There's nothing wrong with it. And so people who want to explore a hedonic direction, whether it's through their five senses and the Fifth Circuit or Sixth Circuit brain pleasure, or on into, Seventh and Eighth hedonic imperatives, They really need to do some Fourth Circuit redefining of their ethical and moral biases, because for the most part we're raised in families that want to hold on to us. The family doesn't want the offspring to go too far from the hub. And so there are certain moralities placed that are very good at keeping the offspring close to the hub through the guilt reflex. And, if you do this and this against the family morality or the hive or herd morality, then you'll be stopped dead in your tracks with guilt or feeling bad or feeling like a no good whatever for doing it. So the moral code really has to be exposed and examined and readjusted to include the exploration of the hedonic impulse as an ethical imperative, as something that's actually serving an ethos. And so then it has to undergo a kind of a creative reconditioning, maybe a re-imprinting, to support the exploration of hedonic directions. And if you don't, then you'll just be haunted by, this kind of, guilt reflex. And if it's not from within yourself, then, you'll become overly sensitive to other people judging you for being selfish or pursuing a life of pleasure or whatever. But if you're at peace with your own ethics and you have redefined your ethics to include the pleasure principle and onward into the higher circuits, what other people think of you, it's not going to impact you. In fact, what other people think of you is probably going to not even be, it won't even be part of your business. It'll be part of their business.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I just think that's a big split that everyone has. They separate into good and bad, and when they're in the lower chakras, it's kind of bad, and then when they're in the higher, it's good. And so I think it's important for you to reiterate this message that you have to connect them all back together and kind of re-bridge those gaps that people have made in the circuits, because it makes schisms in people, and they can't accept those pleasure-seeking parts. And
here's the thing: is that not everybody. It's not like I'm saying you have to do that. That's not the message at all. It's more of a message of trying to show more compassion to the people and to yourselves who are not ready to take that leap. You see, everybody opens up at their own pace is the way I've seen it. And, everybody is asleep at some level. And everybody is dreaming at some level, and everybody is awake at some level. And so I'm just trying to, find a way of relating to the sleep in my life and the sleep in other people's lives with a little more compassion, because I haven't really found a better way of relating to the factor of sleep in people's lives, and I include myself in that.
Can you give an example of one of the practices in the book? Maybe it's something that one would do initially as you're just sort of exploring the map or trying to find out where you are asleep or where you are awake or where you are dreaming?
Yeah, there are many exercises, practices, and rituals, and especially in the new book, the Eighth Circuit Brain book, out on Vertical Pool Publishing. I think a really easy one, or actually it's not easy, it's simple. Let's say simple, but the actual practice may be difficult. Just for 1 week, cover the mirrors in your house. Don't look at mirrors for a week. And that includes at home or at work or, walking down the street and, checking out your reflection in a window display or whatever. See if you can avoid looking at mirrors for a week and see how that acts on your consciousness. The culture that we're in is very dependent on mirrors, and this reflects like a larger confusion of identifying with the image or reflection of who we are as a result of embodying who we are. And you can begin to see some of these culturally imposed patterns simply by depriving yourself of a mirror for a week and seeing how you react and seeing to what degree you have become addicted to validating or knowing yourself through your reflection.
Well, it's true. Even historically, it's interesting that the modern, if we're all kind of carrying not just an ego, but a very modern sense of self. It's something that was constructed and shaped and formatted after the Renaissance, as we enter into a new world of, humanist-driven exploration and the development of capitalism and the development of science, and there's sort of a new kind of ego that emerges with it, and it's the modern self. But it's interesting when you look at like the history of mirrors and the history of interiors, it's really around the time of the beginning of modernity that people start putting mirrors and mirrored surfaces in their homes. So it's like suddenly we actually start to see ourselves more at the very point in history where this modern sense of a kind of autonomous, decisive, in control, competitive, displayed person really comes to the fore, and we're sort of living in the shattered labyrinth a labyrinth of mirrors that results from that.
Well, I think it's clearly reflected in the myth of Narcissus, and the narcissism of the culture, and I think any time where you can expose narcissism in your own life, you've exposed quite a bit. I'm of the mind that a little narcissism goes a long way, and so I like to know where I'm narcissistic and be fine with that and accept it, but I don't want it to spread like an epidemic throughout my entire personality, because there are certain places where I just really don't need the vanity.
Yeah.
Antero, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I know there's an awful lot of focus about the 8-circuit brain model in human beings, but I was wondering how much you've thought about applying that outside of, our own little brains, and if you've done any research at all into animals. Like I know you mentioned some of the work of John Lilly, like his metaprogramming and comparing it to some of the circuit processes. But have you thought about like what some of the implications might be for like 8-circuitry in consciousness outside of ourselves, like in animals or rocks or anything like that?
I haven't, and yes, I have, and I haven't both. There is an animist in me that knows and has experience, has some kind of Gnostic relation with the spirit and things and animals, rocks, water, trees, and so forth in the sky. And through the ritual work I do, this becomes very alive for me. But the whole notion of the 8 circuits seems to me, it has a peculiar human stamp on it. And if I were to impose that onto animals or the earth or anything, it's almost like a kind of anthropomorph. I don't even know the word. There's a word where you're assigning human attributes to non-human entities. And
anthropomorphism, yeah.
That's exactly right, and I don't like to do that. And so I relate very well to the intelligence of animals. I always have cats around me. But there's also this sense that there's some centers in them that I have that are missing, and then there's something in them that I am jealous about, that I want to know more about, because I'm, like, for example, just the way cats move across the surface of the floor, that they just have a quality, and this is actually part of the study I work with my group of paratheater movers, is that we study cats to understand a movement technique called moving as a unit, which is to say, if you watch a cat, they have no resistance to gravity, and they're able to, the way they move across the earth, every piece of them is moving together. There's nothing fragmented or disconnected within them. Every piece is moving as one unit across the floor. And it's just really graceful and wonderful to watch that, and I want to be able to move like that.
Mm.
Well, that's one of the things that seemed really, again, key about the 8th Circuit brain is that it's anthropological. It's not just about human beings as individuals, but it's very conscious and aware of how we are in societies, and we're shaped by institutions, and we're shaped by family relations, and we're shaped by peer pressure and social groups. And that seems to be something really fresh there, because a lot of religions, traditionally, they are themselves, forms of anthropology. They're ways of organizing things, the ways of patterning culture. So they're not as helpful necessarily to illuminate that aspect of ourselves. So it's a modern aspect of the Eighth Circuit brain model that seems really, really helpful, because that's one of the ways that we fall asleep, and one of the ways we wake up is in our relationship with these larger social groups. It's not about just like going into a cave and then meditating and then, wow, okay, now you're free. It's that the very composition of ourselves is based on these larger social units in many ways, and you have to develop an understanding and appreciation for that from the inside in order to begin to know where you're asleep and where you're waking up.
It's true, and I think we need to remember too that the Eighth Circuit brain is an elitist model. Religions are populist models. This is why there will always be more people participating in various religious forms and functions than there will be the Eighth Circuit brain. I imagine that maybe somewhere 5% or under of the population, maybe that's generous, would take interest to the Eighth Circuit brain model, and maybe 1% might do something with it. And so we're really looking at a very narrow band of individuals that have enough autonomy in their own lives to start with, and enough integrity, meaning enough commitment to their own direct experience as a source of authority and autonomy, to be able to even do anything with it. And so it's not a mainstream or populist model by any means, and I would not even recommend it to everybody. I think it's not a system for everybody from what I've seen.
Can you give an example of how, in the exploration of the upper circuits, people find themselves facing, challenges, the collapse of their conventional ways of looking at things, experiences of energy or quote unquote psychic phenomena that they're not prepared for, and so they're suddenly loosed in this new world that's kind of scary and potentially damaging in some ways.
Sure.
But how does how are the lower circuits invoked as a way of grounding or integrating those experiences?
Well, going one by one on the Fifth Circuit, you can engage with such a high level of ecstasy and rapture that you lose all sense of time and all sense of responsibility to your survival needs, and you can go days without cleaning up your apartment or cooking a meal or whatever, and so you can enter a high level of dispersion of your personal energy, kind of blow out with too much rapture and ecstasy. It can happen. And the way in which you can restabilize or reconnect or re-anchor is to focus on First Circuit activities like washing the dishes, doing the laundry, preparing the meal, write a check out for that electric bill so they don't turn it off. So really basic anchors can help stabilize a Fifth Circuit blowout. Sixth Circuit blowout's a little bit more difficult because it's not very difficult to overstimulate the Sixth Circuit. You just take a lot of LSD, just drop a pill, and you can enter all kinds of expansion and mind-expanding realms and all kinds of vision, and open up telepathies and clairvoyances beyond your wildest imagination. And you go out far enough and you start losing touch with your emotional reality, your actual emotional biases and convictions, and you start losing touch with your feelings. And so this is often what can happen in the cases of, for example, of clinically diagnosed schizophrenics and even bipolar disorder to some degree, and other types of mental illness, is that they take on an emotional flatness. They lose connection with the Second Circuit. And so the way to restabilize after a Sixth Circuit blowout of entering so much perception and visionary experience is to find some way to, get back in touch with what is it that makes your life worth living, without which your life might not be worth living. So I'm talking about your basic values, and finding out what those are is very important. Another thing is just finding out, what is it that you can actually depend on in life, or who can you depend on? What is that one sure thing? What is the thing that brings a sense of certitude to your life? Very important to have some connection, some emotional connection to that when you're exposed to high levels of uncertainty. You see, that's the polarity there between high levels of uncertainty requires deeper levels of certitude in your life to anchor that. And so that's how you can anchor that.
Do you have one thing that you use as your anchor?
It shifts and changes, and I myself don't, divulge that because I'm afraid that other people might think that might be the answer. It really is a personal discovery process of finding out, okay, well, is there one? Maybe it's a person, or maybe it's your dog, or maybe it's, something that you do every day, something you can depend on as your one sure thing. Human beings are clinging creatures by habit. And if you're responsible emotionally, you're going to know what that is, and you'll be able to return to that when you need it, when you need that sense of certitude. And if you lose touch with, what is it that brings that sense of emotional satisfaction to your life, unfortunately, that need will be met in other ways, in more distorted ways, usually in creating all kinds of dogmatic assumptions about what it is that you see, because dogma can, in its own kind of way, simulate the kind of emotional certitude that you're actually missing.
Oh, that's very astute. I mean, it's really interesting as you're talking about these. I'm just remembering all of these individuals that I've met in my life, whether they were, heavy psychedelic users or deep, spiritual practitioners. But there's often this sort of sense of that I think it's a problem in hedonic spirituality in general, is that people discover that you can sort of get outside of this conventional self, and that in many ways the conventional self is a sort of a prison, and that there are these other circuits and these other dimensions that seem to have more truth, more life, more bliss, more information, and so it seems like the goal is to just get out, and then you can't really live there, but you've blasted out or deconstructed or developed a great deal of distrust with the conventional self. So you find people who are kind of stuck in between, and there's a sense of groundlessness about them, even as you recognize the validity or the depth of a lot of their experiences. So it's almost like you got to keep a little plot of land that's just where your little house is, and you got your dog, and you got your very human life, and it's sort of a construct, but it's also a beautiful work of performance that has this almost ritualistic effect of grounding. So it's like really getting into doing the dishes, and even the banality of doing the dishes can be an extremely spiritual thing, because it sets a dynamic tension, like a string being plucked between these very abstract, in some ways non-human or sort of transhuman realms, from this very simple one, and really honoring it, not just in lip service again, like it seems like there is a lot of, but really embracing it as an aspect of it.
It's true, and I'm just going to finish with the other upper circuits to maybe if I can share some of what might be potentially catastrophic for them. But before I do, you mentioned something very interesting about some people who never somehow end up in between circuits, or somehow not finding that ground and, in a sense, continuing to drift rudderless, so to speak, through life. And I have a term or a metaphor that I use to address those people who have opened up the higher circuits but have not found a way to anchor and ground, and they have entered and set up a residence in Chapel Perilous. And Chapel Perilous is, for me, a very significant metaphor, which I address in length in the Eighth Circuit Brain Book, especially around ways to identify how you might be in the chapel, and also some possibilities for escape strategies, so that you can, have some choice in the matter if that's what you want. But to go on with the Seventh Circuit blowouts, those experiences involving the shock of indivisibility, where you come into such a high level of unification with all of existence, and all the boundaries are dissolved, and it's this kind of mystical union experience. And it's not a concept. This is a reality, and it's beyond ecstatic, and it places you right in the heart of the universe. The heart of your very being is an expression of the being of all beings, and it goes on, and it's close to infinite. You're, in the process of almost like thinking like DNA at that point. So the Third Circuit provides the anchor, because at that point you have reached a level of experience that is clearly beyond language or the words of the local reality tunnels that you're involved with your culture. You end up in a speechless place of awe and wonder. And if you cannot find some way of languaging that experience and putting it either into poetry or into some fiction or some kind of writing or scripting or some kind of maybe cinematic or musical, some kind of language. And again, the language, I really like Terence McKenna's rather broad definition that language can be many things. In fact, maybe the universe is made of language. So the Third Circuit is all about languaging your experience and interpreting it. And so if you can find ways of putting into some form of language and articulation some of the Seventh Circuit shocks of indivisibility, you really break through into some level of interacting with what the ancient Greeks called the daemon or the genius. And that interaction between Seventh Circuit and Third Circuit we've seen historically in those people of what we call genius level of art, science, music, etc., that these are the people who have actually returned from Seventh Circuit experiences and have found the language to convey that in some way to other people.
Great. Hey, Antero, we only have a couple more minutes, and I know you still have we haven't talked about the eighth one, but I just wanted to give you a chance to let people know about any websites or places they could find out more about your work.
We can leave the Eighth Circuit to people's imagination, or they can read the book about it. You can actually right now for the next 2 months, my book is really only available at verticalpool.com. And if you're in the San Francisco or Bay Area, I'm doing a reading at Fields Books October 22nd. That's Thursday night at 8 p.m. That's in San Francisco, Fields Books. And also in Berkeley at the Finnish Hall in Berkeley the following week, Thursday, October 29th. And all that information is also at verticalpool.com as well. And people can find out about my film work there. All my films are now available on DVD, and I sell them through the website and also through my other publisher, the Original Falcon Press, which I highly recommend people go check out as well.
Great. Well, we have time for one little last burst. Give us a 30-second breakdown of the Eighth Circuit to Fourth Circuit connection.
I should probably laugh for 30 seconds. You're tempting me.
I know that's the thing. Well, Antero, it's been really great to have you on. I really enjoy this stuff, and I hope that people seek out your work, and that we hear more from you. And Maja, don't you have an event coming up pretty soon?
I do. I'm going to do a little Halloween tour on October 31st. You can find out information about that on my website, which is godismyboyfriend.com.
Where did you get that name?
Because he's totally my boyfriend, dude.
That's great. I love that.
Awesome. And let's see, on my end, next week is the last week of my the run of my Burning Man opera, How to Survive the Apocalypse in San Francisco. It's been an extremely successful run. Very happy about that. But if you're in the area, there's still some tickets left, and you can find out about that on my website as well, techgnosis.com, TECHGNOSIS.com. SIS.com. And so from all of us here at the ever-expanding mind, although we have to integrate it as well, right, Antero? Thank you, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.